Hello and welcome to the Runners World podcast with me, Rick Pearson. This week we're speaking with Steve Magness about why people get mental strength wrong and what true toughness actually looks like. On the subject of mental toughness, there's been a new 24-hour British record. Robbie Britton claimed the new record racing over in Torino, Italy, where he ran a staggering 277.439 kilometres. That's about 172.7 miles in 24 hours, and that's better than the previous record, which was held way back, or set way back in 1982 by David Dowdall. And Robbie said to Runners World, the British 24-hour record has been a goal of mine for many years, so it's a dream come true to finally run it. The psychological battle was as hard as the physical one. The legs start hurting early doors and you still have 18 hours to go. The mind wants you to stop or slow down, and I had to take it 1 hour at a time to convince myself it was all worth it, that the record was still possible. The last 6 to 8 hours, when I had to keep working hard the whole time to maintain record pace, it was really tough. It means the world to me to be able to call myself a British record holder, proper bucket list stuff. So many congrats to Robbie for setting that record. That's absolutely amazing. And we've had a couple of letters in as well. One is about the hardest road races. So this is something that we talked about over the last few weeks, and the hardest road race was Langdale. Apparently has a 15% DNF rate up in the Lake District. It's got loads of climbing. But a listener, Toby Bellis, wrote in and said, although not a full marathon, Sheffield half marathon is worth a mention. The first 5 miles is a climb out to the Peak District. I've always seen more people drop out and struggle on this than I have any other marathon. So there you go. Hard half marathon there, Sheffield half marathon. And on the subject of taking good race photos, which we were discussing a while back, and Ben, Jane and I were lamenting that we never look good in race photos. Christopher Wagner wrote in. He said, on a recent episode, I was saddened to hear the three of you were unhappy with your race photos. My fiance and I run the races at Walt Disney World, where there are a lot of photographers on the course. The following advice helped my friends and me to have amazing photos 85% of the time. So here we go. Number 1, keep an eye out for photographers so you're not surprised. Number 2 is to raise your chin slightly. Number 3 is smile so large that it feels goofy. It will look normal at mile 25 of the marathon. And number 4 is increase your pace just a tiny bit. It won't spoil your race, but it will improve your form drastically because it forces you to think about it. So some good tips there from Christopher. Thanks very much for the letters. If you want to write in, we'd love to read letters out. It's always great to hear people, back from listeners. So it's podcast@runnersworld.co.uk. All right, I think we should get on our really pretty high profile guest of the week. Steve Magness is globally renowned performance coach. So it's absolutely great to catch up with him about the very enlightened way that he's now looking at mental strength and is encouraging other runners to do so. So hopefully you get a lot out of this interview, and let's get on our guest of the week.
Guest of the week, here in the studio. Guest of the week, sometimes on the phone. Could be an athlete, could be a physio, or a complete unknown.
So our guest this week is a world-renowned expert in health and performance. His latest book, Do Hard Things, looks at why we get mental strength all wrong and what true toughness actually means. Steve Magness, welcome to the Runners World podcast.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. Really looking forward to the conversation.
No, it's a pleasure to have you on. So with your new book, Do Hard Things, why did you want to write it?
I think we write the books that we need and are wrestling with.
Yeah.
So as a lifelong runner, I've always wrestled with this idea of toughness, because what is running except kind of being alone in your head and fighting those demons that tell you to slow down or drop out or whatever have you. So I've always kind of had this in the back of my mind. And what I was kind of seeing in the wider range is that almost the view we kind of took in running on navigating these difficult moments, I think, was a little bit better often than the kind of wider range of put your head down, push through, ignore all the pain and suffering, just grit your teeth and get through it. And my experience as a runner was that, yeah, sometimes I needed to do that, but often I try and do that and it would fail miserably. So it was just kind of this topic I've been wrestling with in the back of my head for years. And I just thought, you know what, let's try and bring some clarity to it.
Where do you think that idea of kind of get your head down, no pain, no gain, like where's that coming from? Where do you think this sort of traditional idea of mental strength emanates from?
Yeah, so I went down a long winding path to try and answer that question. And the best I can get to you is that it has its roots in kind of the military like mindset of doing difficult things. And you can trace it all the way back, to kind of modern military equations. But I think really it kind of came out of, we kind of really saw this flourishing in after World War II, because all of a sudden you had all these just everyday people who got drafted into the military and put through boot camp and put through some crazy stuff and had to get ready for some extreme situations very quickly. It's not like you had years to train or even months. It's like train them up, throw them over, into the World War. And what happened is, I think out of that, we just got this conceptualization of like, oh, this is how you get tough really quickly. And in fact, especially in the US, but also in the UK, what you saw in the sporting culture is that most of the kind of athletic coaches like were in the war. Right. They were because they were part of it, and they come home and it's like, oh, we return home. Now we're the PE teachers, the athletic coaches, the football coaches, the track coaches. So this kind of military short-term mindset kind of infiltrated and took over athletics. And in fact, in the like 1950s and 60s, especially in American football, but also in other sports, all the metaphors started to change towards like sport and war. It's right. Like we're going to war today.
Yeah. And I guess, you talk about this a bit in the book, but it's a philosophy that you took on yourself in your early careers as a runner, and you feel like actually, can you tell us a little bit about that? How that was a philosophy that you were following early on, and kind of what the consequences were of doing so?
Yeah, so absolutely. So, like anybody, I thought that was kind of the way, the put your head down, grit your teeth, grind through it. And it's kind of funny because it works to a degree, but I think the consequence comes when it doesn't work, and it's not going to work all the time. Because what it does is it almost puts you in a situation where if you don't run your PB or you don't run as well as you want, you're kind of left questioning like, well, am I not tough enough? Like maybe I'm mentally weak, and you quote unquote fail, and you see that failure as like a reflection on your kind of like mental abilities, and that can lead to some very kind of striking psychological and also physiological consequences, where it's like, it's almost like you're training your brain to have like one tool. I almost see it as like, if all you have is a hammer, then sure, the hammer works when a nail is in front of you. But as we know as runners, like we're not always going to get a nail. Sometimes we're going to need a screwdriver or saw or whatever have you to get through the difficult thing. And if all we think is the hammer is the only solution, then more often than not, we're going to get frustrated and struggle.
So let's talk about some of those more enlightened solutions then. You mentioned a few themes in your book that I'd love to talk about are... say that your emotions are messengers, not dictators. And could you tell us what you mean when you say that?
Yeah, so absolutely. So often I think we think of emotion as something that we should like push away, right? It's like push away the pain. In America, we have this famous saying like no crying in baseball, like never show your emotions, right? And the thing is, that's a complete misunderstanding of the science and psychology of emotions. So emotions and feelings are essentially messengers, meaning they're like signals to our kind of conscious awareness that, hey, something is going, something is interesting. We'll put it that. Could be interesting in a good way, could be interesting in a bad way, but they're essentially saying like, hey, pay attention to this thing. Like you might need to be aware. It's almost like the warning lights on our car or our a pilot's cockpit. Like they're saying, hey, something's a little different than normal, like be aware. And I think if we ignore those, then what we're doing is we're ignoring our kind of body's communication system. It's not saying, hey, slow down, stop, you're in danger. What it's saying is like, hey, there's something to pay attention to. So let me give you the running example. Is fatigue is essentially an emotion. So if we're going and running a marathon, for example, and we start to feel like that fatigue that is almost like fatigue that you're kind of running out of fuel a little bit, right? That feeling like, oh, okay, I'm getting a little lethargic. All that is sending us is like, if we ignore it and we say, hey, let's tough it through it, we're probably going to bonk. If we say, hey, I'm getting a signal that I'm running a little bit low, well, guess what? We're going to get our gel or our sports drink and like take a sip, get some calories. And more often than not, that feeling's going to go down a little bit. Not go away completely, but it's going to be like, oh, our brain goes, okay, heard the signal. We got fuel on the way. We can still keep going at this pace.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. You also talk about owning the voice in your head, which I think is actually kind of what you've touched on there. And there's that kind of famous quote about running, just being a conversation between the part of you that wants to quit and the kind of winning that conversation. Is there a way to have a more nuanced conversation though with the voice in your head rather than the sort of trampling down idea?
So the other way to deal with it is change how you talk to yourself. So one of the things that we know is that whenever that kind of negative voice, comes in, is we take it very personally and we actually change how we talk to ourselves a little bit. It's always like, why am I a failure? I can't do this. So it's all kind of first person. And research in psychology actually shows when we talk in first person, our brain kind of interprets it as being more personal and amplifies the negative emotional experience that comes with it. On the flip side, if we talk in second or third person, it actually creates what psychologists call psychological distance. And it decreases that emotional attachment to the voice, and it allows us to kind of feel and do something about it. So if I'm sitting there or if I'm running and I'm like, come on, Steve, you can do this, the brain interprets it a little bit differently and is more likely to listen to that positive voice than like go down that negative spiral towards negativity. So sometimes just changing how you talk to yourself can have a big effect.
This is the Runner's World podcast.
What do you think would be an example of like phony mental strength, and what would be an example of true mental strength? I know it's quite a big question, but I wonder if you could give an idea of like maybe what the old-fashioned way is holding up as mental strength, but actually what does it look like, do you think?
Yeah, so I think the old-fashioned is a lot of external, meaning like you're putting on a show, you have false bravado, you're almost that person who's like, and we all know it, and we all do it sometimes, you're almost like projecting, like maybe if I act really confident and talk a big game, like it won't be a big deal. And what the research shows, and what this kind of new science of toughness shows, is that often that just sets us up for failure because we're setting our expectations up. So if I go into, I don't know, my 5K park run, and I've never done one before, and I say, oh, this is going to be a piece of cake. Like I've done a couple runs, like I'm going to be okay. Well, inevitably it's going to get difficult. And if you go in with the mind, I have this no matter what, and this kind of false bravado, the moment it gets difficult, our brain almost overreacts. It's almost like it goes, hey, wait a minute. You told us this is going to be a piece of cake, and now I'm feeling like it's going to be. Now I'm feeling the difficulty, and it freaks out. And even if you're an experienced runner, you experience this. I did not too long ago, coming back from a long bout of injury, and my brain is kind of going with the old Steve, the fit Steve, where it's like, oh, okay, going out and doing this moderate workout, this isn't a big deal. But because I'd been off for so long, the reality is it was it was going to be more difficult than I thought. So that mismatch in perception and reality sets you up to kind of freak out. So the new kind of idea of toughness is, instead of like this external false bravado, it's more like the internal of like accepting the reality of the situation. Like, how difficult may this be? How fit am I actually? Like, what kind of capabilities I have? And you want that match that alignment over those two instead of the kind of false bravado that we're all often taught.
I think one of the things that we've discussed this on the podcast for me and the other hosts about the DNF and kind of how this is often in runners' minds as like the ultimate, like, oh, I didn't finish the race. Where does kind of like quitting fit into this? Do you think that bailing on a race or workout is a sign of mental weakness, or are we in the kind of world of the ego there again?
You know, what really brought clarity to that question is I was talking to some world-class climbers. And they were saying, you know what the tough part of climbing something like Mount Everest or K2 or whatever is? And I'm like, I have no idea. Never done anything like that. And they essentially said, it's when you're getting to the summit. It's maybe a couple hundred meters away, a couple hours away. And you see it and you think, here is the goal I've been training my lifetime for, like years, poured tens of thousands of dollars into all that stuff, and it's within reach. And in that moment, you have to say, okay, pause. Can I make it not only to the top, but turn around and make it all the way to the bottom? And often the answer is no, I can't, because the large majority of accidents happen in that zone, often when you've made it to the top and you're coming back down and don't have the energy to do so. So in that situation, the tough decision is to quit, to turn around, to be able to pause and say, do I have the energy or not? And if I don't, I need to get out of here to live another day. And I think in running, although it's not life or death, we often demonize the bailing on the workout, the quitting of the race. But the reality is, it's closer to that climbing example, is if there is a reason, a logical reason to it, where you are maybe saving yourself for another day, or there's a potential injury coming, or you're under the weather and you shouldn't do this workout because it's just going to, dig you in a hole that's going to set you back more than push you forward. Like, those are the moments where we need to kind of put our ego aside and say, you know what? It's not my day. And I actually think elite marathoners do this a little bit better than the novice, because you look at them and yeah, they'll tough it out sometimes, but sometimes they'll be like, you know what? It's not my day. And for them, it's their career, in the sense that it's like, hey, if I'm at mile 15 and I'm already falling apart, sure, I could tough it out and finish, but then I'm not going to get to run another marathon for 6 months or so, whatever. And this is my career. So maybe if I drop out at 15, I can do another marathon in 2 months and have a better, a better effort and a better payday and all that good stuff. So I think, again, it's a balance. We don't want to just say, hey, quit whenever you feel like it. Yeah. But you want to be able to, like those climbers, make that wise decision in the moment, where sometimes the better answer is to quit.
I think that's a really good parallel example. In terms of training, I wonder about when it comes to mental strength, and maybe some of the ego that comes with this, if this also plays into people maybe not being able to do easy runs at an easy pace, or doing too much of their running in a kind of middle zone. Where do you see that fitting in terms of like getting your training right, in terms of mental strength and real mental toughness?
So I think this is a great example, because when we run too hard on our easy days, all it is insecurity.
Yes, yeah.
And there's a wonderful story that I tell in the book, but I think it's worth telling, is there's an American marathoner back in the 1950s called Buddy Edelin. And he set the world record in the marathon. And there was this correspondence back and forth with his coach. And I forget the context exactly, but essentially before a race, he ran an easy run that was too long and too fast.
Right.
And his coach writes back in this journal, he says, "This is a manifestation of uncertainty. There is a time to rest, not halfway rest." And what he was getting at is, like, here's this world-class runner, marathon world record holder, and even he was struggling with, maybe I'm going to lose fitness if I don't run this run long enough going into the race, or fast enough. In the reality, the coach was saying, hey, this is insecurity, essentially. Like, you're fit, all you can do is get in your own way. You're getting in your own way. And I think that's where we see it often with, from novices to experienced runners is like that recovery run, that easy run, that run where we're supposed to kind of be disciplined on our easy stuff. We get a little insecure and we say, maybe I could get a little more fitness if I ran this faster, or, ran a little bit longer, or what have you. And we're just deviating from what's probably best for us because that voice in our head is telling us like, oh, just push a little bit more, push a little bit more. And the reality is, if we stuck to the plan, we'd probably be fitter and faster.
Yeah, I think that's right. Steve, if people want to find out more about what you do and also get hold of Do Hard Things, where can they go?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find me on just about every social media at Steve Magness or stevemagness.com. And then Do Hard Things is available in every bookstore or online bookstore you can get it at. So check it out.
Steve, thanks so much for your time coming on the Runners World podcast. Absolute pleasure to have you on talking about the real science of mental toughness. And thank you very, very much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
So that brings us to the end of this week's Runners World podcast. A huge thanks to our special guest, Steve Magness, and to you, of course, for listening. You can subscribe to 3 issues of Runners World for just £5. Head over to hurstmagazines.co.uk/Runners World podcast to get this exclusive listener offer. You can listen to the Runners World UK podcast on Acast, iTunes, and all your favourite podcast apps. Just search Runners World UK. Please subscribe. Makes us very happy. And thanks for listening. We'll see you again next week.